The sky over Hopewell Gulch didn't darken. It closed. 1 second, a flat grey afternoon. The next, the light folded shut like a door swinging on a hinge nobody could see. Elias Cormack was already moving. The strange part wasn't that he was moving. It was that he was the only man in Hopewell who was. He dropped the leather strap in his hands, whistled once, short, and by the time his mule Ember had spun toward him, he was already walking her toward the mountain. Outside, the wind hadn't started screaming yet. In less than 2 minutes, it would. He'd known for 2 days that something enormous was coming. 7 nights from that moment, he'd be standing outside this same door with a shovel in the dark, wondering whether the mountain he'd trusted for a year was about to bury every person he'd let inside it. The real question isn't what this storm was. It's what one man knew, 10 months earlier, that an entire town refused to believe. Right up until it was too late for most of them to matter. Before we go further, if you're the type who likes stories like this one, hit subscribe and drop the name of your hometown in the comments. It genuinely helps this reach more people, and I read every one. 10 months before that door closed, Elias stood across a land office counter from Silas Pruitt, the town's banker, watching his finger drag toward good, flat, sunlit acreage south of the creek. Elias's finger was somewhere else, a broken shale outcrop 1/2 mile up the gulch, with a gash torn into the rock wide enough to drive a wagon through. Pruitt laughed. "That's not land, Cormac. That's a hole with weeds on it." "That hole," Elias said, "is exactly what I'm here for." Pruitt stamped the deed like he was closing a door on the whole conversation. "Your funeral," he said. He wasn't wrong about the funeral part. He was just wrong about whose. Elias wasn't building a cave. He was building a machine, and the strange thing was almost every part of that machine was already sitting there in the rock, waiting to be noticed. The mountain would hold the temperature no stove ever could. The angle of the entrance would catch the winter sun and dodge the summer glare. The rock itself would kill the wind before it ever touched a wall. Willa found the last piece herself. Crouched beside his dirt sketch on their first night camping at the site, lift the floor, and the damp would never climb into the timber. Then she found something else. A shallow groove ran along one edge of the cave mouth, worn smooth by what looked like years of spring runoff cutting its own path away from the entrance instead of into it. She traced it with her boot, said nothing much about it, and Elias marked it on his sketch without giving it a second thought. It didn't matter to the plan, not yet. "So we're not heating a house," she said instead. "We're nudging what the mountain already gives us for free." "You're not just a wife who nods at my ideas," he told her. "No," she said, "I'm the reason your ideas survive contact with reality." It wasn't shelter. It was an agreement with the mountain instead of a war against it. Whether Hopewell would ever see it that way was a different matter, and the town's verdict came fast and ugly. Within a month, curiosity had curdled into sport. Gideon Marsh, who owned the biggest barn in the county, rode up just to look down at Elias clearing shale off the cave floor. "That barn of mine cost $1,100, and you're fixing to live like a badger in a burrow. Ask me again in a year, Mr. Marsh." The name stuck before Marsh's horse had turned around. The homestead became Thornmouth. By June, if a man in Hopewell did something stubborn and backward when an easy path sat right in front of him, the town said he'd gone Thornmouth. The cruelest cut came at the spring social. Marsh led a round of toasts to every homesteader who'd filed that year, every name but one. When someone finally asked about the Cormac claim, he raised his glass anyway. To the only man in this county who built himself a grave and moved in early. The room laughed. Willa didn't. She watched her husband say nothing and understood exactly what silence like that costs a man. Louisa Byrne, who taught 40 children in the schoolhouse, used the Cormacs as a lesson. "We came down out of the caves for a reason," she told her class, loud enough for Willa to hear through the mercantile wall. "To live in one now is to turn your back on progress." Remember that line. They kept building anyway. By September, the walls were packed and sealed, the flue capped. They moved in on September 30th, 1886. While Hopewell sweated through an October heat spell, the cave stayed cool. While frost hit in November, the little stove burned an hour a day, and the woodpile barely moved. By day 3 of the first real cold snap that winter, Elias half believed they'd already proven everything they needed to prove, until the flu iced over one night in a way he hadn't planned for, filling the antechamber with a thin haze of smoke before he woke and cleared it by lantern light, hands numb, half panicked in a way the town never saw. Nobody in Hopewell ever heard about that night. It cost them nothing but sleep and one badly frozen ridge cap Elias reset the next morning. But it taught him something the design alone hadn't. Thornmouth wasn't finished proving itself. It had simply passed its first small test in private. They hadn't won the argument yet. Winter hadn't asked its real question. On January 9th, 1887, Elias checked the barometer he'd bought in Denver, the one Marsh had laughed at, and didn't like the number. He checked it again that afternoon, lower. He rode into town and warned Ezra Vance, the county's best builder, at the lumber yard. "Bank your fires low tonight. This is worse than anything I've read the sky for." Vance chuckled, stacking planks. "It's January in the Rockies, Cormac. It's always bad." Elias rode home and checked the barometer a third time before he barred the door. The needle had stopped moving. It had nowhere left to fall, day one. The storm didn't arrive. It detonated. By sunset, Hopewell's church steeple had vanished into white. By midnight, nobody in town could find the road to the cemetery 50 yards from their own doorstep. The snow had stopped falling. It had started building walls. Day two. It cost Gideon Marsh his pride first. The first crack from his $1,100 barn sounded like a rifle shot, then another. Then the whole roof went down at once, and 18 head of his prize cattle disappeared beneath it. Marsh, trapped in his own house by drifts past the windowsills, could only listen. Day three. Firewood became the real enemy. Vance's sealed, proper houses had never met wind that could pack a window frame solid. His youngest daughter stopped asking when the storm would end. She started asking if they were going to die. He didn't have an answer for her. Day four. Two shapes appeared out of the white that evening, crawling more than walking. For a long moment Elias couldn't tell who they were. Then he saw the coat. Ezra Vance. Cormac. His voice cracked. "My wife. The children. Our fire's out." Elias looked past him into the storm. "Where are they?" Vance's mouth opened. Nothing came out for a moment that stretched far too long. They were still back there. He'd sent his boy ahead to find help and lost sight of the rest of his family in the whiteout less than a quarter mile from his own porch. Elias was already pulling on his coat. He followed the fence line he'd strung a year earlier, rope tied to his own belt, Willer's lantern the only light he could trust. At the third post, nothing. At the fourth, a single glove, half buried, no hand inside it. For a moment he genuinely believed he'd find the rest of them too late, that the storm had already finished what it started. Then he heard it. Not a voice. A cough, small and human, from a drift that looked from 6 feet away like every other drift in the gulch. He dug with his hands. Vance's wife first, then the 2 younger children, curled together against a fence post that had done exactly what a fence post was never meant to do, hold 3 people alive. By the time they got everyone back inside, Vance sat shaking, both hands around a mug of broth like it was the only solid thing left in the world. "You were right," he said. "God help me. You were right." He was the first through the door. He would not be the last. Day 5. 1 became 3. 3 became 9. Silas Pruitt staggered in that morning, face blackened with frostbite. He looked around the stone chamber, the same hole with weeds on it, and couldn't bring himself to repeat his own words from 10 months earlier. Behind him came Louisa Byrne, leading 4 of her students by the hand. The same children who'd once heard her call a cave a failure to embrace progress now sat wrapped in blankets around Elias's stove, warmer than they'd been in 3 days. 9 became 17 by nightfall. Now Elias had a second storm to manage. The shelter that had saved them was starting to strain under its own success. Willer noticed it first. The stove was drawing badly, 31 lungs worth of breath and heat changing the air inside the mountain faster than the chimney could carry it out. She didn't wait for Elias to work it out. She moved half the newcomers into the outer chamber, spread the stored hay to break the cold off the stone, and had the children boiling snow in shifts to save the well water. He found out what she'd done after it was already done. Day 6. 31 people were sheltering inside Thornmouth by morning. Willer found Elias at the edge of the outer chamber that night, doing math in the dark. Can we hold them all? I don't know. 3 words he hadn't said out loud in 10 months. Neither of them said the other number aloud. The drift outside the antechamber had grown 2 meters since sunrise. Day 7. By dawn, the drift had climbed within a hand's width of the stone lip above the entrance. Once it crested that lip, it wouldn't just block the door. It would seal it, with 31 people on the wrong side of the rock and no one outside who'd ever know to look. Elias worked alone at first, breaking the drift back by hand. Willa joined him an hour later and dragged 2 loose fence rails across the leading edge to slow the wind from repacking what they'd cleared. For a while, it held. The first rail lasted maybe 3 seconds under the next gust. Then, crack! It snapped clean through the middle, and snow came through the gap like water through a broken dam, faster than either of them could shovel it back. Willa looked at Elias. We're not clearing this fast enough. Behind them, 31 people were sleeping through what might be the last hour any of them had a door left to wake up to. That's when Willa looked down and saw it. The groove. The same shallow channel she'd traced with her boot almost a year earlier and never mentioned again, angling away from the entrance instead of into it. What if we stop fighting it? She said. Elias looked at her like she hadn't finished the sentence. What? She pointed. They packed the loose snow into the channel instead of clearing it outright, using their own bodies to block the wind from repacking the gap. For a long, terrible stretch, nothing happened. The drift kept climbing. Then it started to move, slowly, then faster, the mountain doing in minutes what a spring thaw usually took weeks to finish, carrying the snow away along a path it had already known for longer than either of them had been alive. They didn't know, working through that last hour, whether it would hold before the storm broke. That's the part no plaque, decades later, would ever mention. Then, for the first time in 7 days, Elias heard something he hadn't heard once since the 9th of January. Nothing. No wind, no timber cracking somewhere down the gulch, no snow ticking against stone. He opened the door. Sunlight came into the mountain for the first time in a week. What lay beneath it barely looked like the same valley. Hopewell was gone, buried under drifts past the roof lines. 9 people never came out. 3 had died trying to save animals that were already doomed. The schoolhouse still stood. The town inside it would not be the same for a generation. 31 people who had walked into a hole in a hillside were not among the 9. A week later, Gideon Marsh climbed the gulch trail, hat in his bare hands. I was wrong. Silence. I was very wrong. You're standing here, Marsh, Elias said. That's what matters now. Vance came back with a notebook instead of his old certainty. I've spent 20 years building houses to fight this valley. You built one that cooperates with it. Teach me. Elias did, freely, and with his own labour besides. By the next winter, 14 new shelters stood scattered across the county, each one carrying a piece of what he'd learned 7 years before anyone believed him, and a piece of what Willa had worked out in the dark on the worst night of her life. Elias Cormack lived to be 71 and died in the cabin he'd carved into the rock. Willa stayed on 11 years after, a respected elder the whole valley came to for advice. They're buried together on the ridge above the cave mouth. In 1958, the state mounted a plaque at the entrance, mocked as madness, proven as wisdom, a mountain that endured and 31 lives that endured with it. The sky above that ridge still closes without warning some afternoons, the same way it did in 1887. The mountain doesn't. There are hundreds of forgotten survival techniques like this. Ideas that look primitive right up until the modern solution fails. If you want more stories about the people who knew how to survive before the world forgot how, subscribe. And tell me, what's one old technique you think we gave up on too soon?